I'm Peter Susskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. In this show, guests from across the political spectrum and from every corner of the globe share their views in their own voice. While the Stimson Center seeks to provide access to a wide variety of perspectives, it does not endorse any particular position. We leave it to the listeners to judge the validity and value of the views expressed by the guests. My guest today is Fyodor Lukyanov, editor-in-chief of Russian Global Affairs, host of the weekly TV program International Review, chairman of the Presidium of the Council for Foreign and Defense Policy, and research professor at the Higher School of Economics. Fyodor is among the most influential and astute Russian commentators on foreign affairs. This is his second appearance on the podcast. I hope you enjoy the episode. Fyodor, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here again.
Much has happened in the relatively new year. There has been a rather dramatic implementation of the Trump Corollary, so-called, to the Monroe Doctrine. What do you make of that move in Moscow?
I think that's quite an interesting reaction. On the one hand, I can say that people are impressed. It does not mean positively, but impressed by what has happened. The military intervention of the United States in another country, the regime change is actually nothing new. We saw it before many times, even in the relatively recent past, but not to talk about what all of us read in books about Latin America in 20th century, 19th century, and so on. And people, of course, expected something like this to happen, that Americans will overthrow a regime, place occupation forces in Venezuela, and so on. And it was quite unusual, to put it very mildly, that it didn't happen. And I think that the main reaction, if I try to summarize it, is that it's not so much about American very much brutal way to conduct its interest. It's actually not very much new again. But the format, which each time is different from expectations in the period of Donald Trump, brings people to the conclusion that the main thing is not how to react to this particular move or another move. The question is that international environment has changed profoundly. The United States in this environment is absolutely different than recently. And it has to do with the United States, of course, because the United States is a very active, transformative power, but actually is not only about that. It's about the total reshuffle of the international system, for which Russia, frankly, was not entirely prepared. And what we have now, it's a deep, if not confusion, that a deep consideration what to do next, what implications it can have.
But is there now a feeling in Russia, in official circles, or more perhaps among commentators, that this American move means that it's totally fine to just openly claim a sphere of influence?
Absolutely, but not exactly this. It's clear manifestation of this sphere of influence approach on the American side. It does not necessarily mean that United States and Trump in particular mean that others have the same right. So this sphere of influence is something which Americans have, and Americans will defend it, that sphere of influence. But it's not the isolationism, we are back to our Western Hemisphere and do what you want. Not at all. And we see that activities, including these days, clear firm stand on Iran, shows that we cannot expect this carte blanche from the US administration to other countries to do whatever they want in their neighborhoods. Whether we like it or not, but still now United States have accumulated power, which is still hardly comparable to anybody else. At the same time, I think it's important to note, and some commentators in Russia say it, that Donald Trump, who looks extremely brave, and he tries to appear disregarding anything because he's totally sure that America is stronger than anybody else. But at the same time, he confronts countries and situations where he is sure that the response cannot be given, at least the consequences for the United States will not be negative. In case he is not sure, or the result is different as for example, in this tariff conflict with China, then he is very much calculated. He understands that this particular aspect of might is not necessarily overwhelming, then okay, let's try something else. And I think that all international players will seriously look at their own capabilities, to understand where they have instruments, assets, which might stop the United States. And of course, what happened quite immediately after Maduro case, the use of Oreshnik by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, that's just a gesture again, but that's a gesture which has a aim to remind the United States about Russian ultimate advantage.
Although that was justified as a response to the apparent drone attack on Putin's residence, right? A response had long been promised, and this was framed as a retaliation for that attack. But you're saying that this is sort of broadly a signal that Russia shouldn't be messed with beyond a certain point, and the Venezuela case is wrapped up into that.
I think so. Maybe not necessarily Venezuela case, but the case which followed Venezuela intervention with this oil tanker, which has been seized by Americans. The story behind this tanker is extremely murky. So no one can understand what happened. And even the official statement by Dmitry Medvedev did include an indication that it was not that clean as we would love to see. But still, it was under Russian jurisdiction. It was taken, and then it was responded in a way.
But neither side seems to be interested in picking a fight over this tanker. Both have pretended that it didn't really belong to Russia. Even Medvedev, as you said, who is typically an absolutely extraordinary fire-breathing monster, at least online, was strangely conciliatory in this case. So to return briefly to Venezuela specifically, does Moscow feel like it has lost an important asset? Is there anything potentially to the whispers that Russia might have actually turned a blind eye and that this is part of some broader exchange of Venezuela for Ukraine? Is there a chance that Russia can remain, since the regime seems to remain in place, that it will keep certain of its assets in Venezuela? What is Venezuela to Russia?
First of all, I think that there is a possibility that Russia will keep something in Venezuela, not playing the previous role, but something. And here I can recall the case of Syria, because when Assad was deposed late 2024, absolutely everybody in Moscow, outside Russia, were sure that the Russian bases would be kicked out, and of course Russian presence there would be eliminated completely. It didn't happen. It didn't happen because of much more reasonable leaders of Syria, reasonable compared to what people expected. And it didn't happen probably because some outside players, in particular Turkey, and Israel, by the way, decided that the presence of Russian bases there would be in one or another way useful. Of course, Venezuela is a different case, but at the same time, again, the old regime basically is in place. I think that the much bigger question is not for Russia, but for China, because the biggest partner of Venezuela, Maduro, Chavez before, was actually China. And politically, in slogans, Chavez and then Maduro claimed a lot very positive things about Moscow. But in material terms and practical terms, China was very deeply involved and invested a lot into Chavista regime. So now the question is whether whether they will be able to communicate with Trump and the United States to keep some assets or to withdraw some assets and so on. As far as the political side is concerned, of course, there are people here saying that that's another humiliation. We had to defend our ally and so on. But even those who are very much anti-American understand that Venezuela is very, very far away. So the real ability of Russia to do something to support this regime, especially given the fact that the regime was not in the best shape since quite a while, those capacities remain very limited. So, what struck me even before this case last year, we come back to this more general conceptual view. What is happening, and Trump is a herald of this, is the revaluation of what matters in the international relations. Because during the period of liberal globalization, a view emerged and prevailed that basically territory is not that important. You might have an ally 10,000 kilometers away from you, and that is fine, because in today's world of rapid communications, you are there online all the time. For example, I remember many, many years ago in 2000s, then-time president of Kyrgyzstan, Askar Akayev, he gave a lecture in Moscow, and he said that, our country, Kyrgyzstan, has three great neighbors. Those are Russia, China, and the United States. Why United States, would you ask? Because the United States is the biggest neighbor of any country in the world. And so that was the approach.
I spent 2011 on a U.S. State Department Fulbright in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, expressing my neighborly affection for that faraway country.
Yeah. Anyway, what we see now is actually come back to the classical geopolitical approach that territory matters, neighborhood matters. So first of all, you should bring in order your surroundings, and then you might do something else, but it's less important. And I think that it's more or less accepted in Russia now for a reason which has not so much to do with Trump or Venezuela or other new trends, but because the process of rethinking of the post-Soviet period is happening. This year, 26, we will mark 35 years since collapse of the Soviet Union. That's a very long historical period, even in any time, any epoch, but especially now, when time has been condensed and so on. And I think that the main priority now on the official level, on the expert level, is put on this issue, how to rearrange Russia as part of this bigger Eurasian neighborhood. And the conclusion is very, very simple and very obvious, that resources are limited and you cannot spend on everything. I think even the United States think in those terms, but especially Russia. Coming back to your question, Venezuela, that's a bad thing from the Russian point of view. Maduro was a friend. He visited Russia many times. Russia tried to make him part of BRICS or partners of BRICS 2024 during the Kazan summit. And by the way, at that time, the country which prevented that was Brazil, because they have very bad relationship. And Russian leadership was very sad about this, and Maduro was extremely negative. But now I think it was a good development, because if Venezuela would be part of BRICS or partners of BRICS, that would be even less convenient situation for us.
So Russia essentially understands and accepts the United States' desire to dominate its own region, is not terribly upset about the outcome, and Venezuela may maintain some assets there if it can come to an arrangement with the new version of the old regime and the United States. But what if it turns out, as you said, that the United States is claiming an exclusive sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, but also right to intervene elsewhere, namely in Iran? Who knows what will have happened there by the time this podcast is released. Is it fair to assume that Russia would react much more acutely to American intervention in Iran?
That's another completely different story because, first of all, I don't believe that Americans will intervene. So to imagine the American intervention in Iran, boots on the ground, it's very difficult. And it's against what Trump is trying to demonstrate all the time. At this point, it looks like expectations in Israel and the United States and in all countries negative to the Iranian regime is that mass protests in the situation of deep socioeconomic crisis will undermine the regime from within. And there are some signs that there is a significant domestic internal clash between groups and factions of the Iranian leadership or establishment. Of course, it might be not enough because Iran demonstrated several times quite a high degree of resilience to such kind of instigated riots. In case it will be an attempt to inflame by coming directly, for example, by Israelis, no, it will be a different reaction on the Russian side. It will be a different reaction on the Chinese side. Because first of all, if Venezuela is there, very far away, that's the American sphere, we will not accept it officially, but everybody understands it. Iran is here. Iran is an important pillar of the whole Eurasian construction, Eurasian constellation, and that will be seen by many, including, I guess, even some Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf, as a very dangerous destabilization.
You mean if Israel or the U.S. were to intervene directly militarily?
Intervene directly and will try to seriously destroy the existing state in Iran. I think that whatever Russia and China would think in this situation, and China, for example, Chinese approach is very well known. That's always a willingness to be calm and to be distant, not to intervene. But in this case, they will be forced, both Russia and China, and maybe some other countries in the region, will be forced to react in one or another way. Of course, it's not so much Russia can do in case the Iranian regime will suddenly collapse from within.
Are there any lessons learned from the Syrian case that if a regime looks rotten enough, it is not worth sustaining? Or is it so important because it is a BRICS member, it is nearby, that Russia has an interest in keeping this regime in place, even if it is seriously weakened?
Yeah, I think so. It's difficult to compare with Syria because Syrian regime at the end of Assad period was basically non-existing. So it was totally discredited and no one wanted to even think about attempts to defend it. And as we know, Assad asked both Iranians and Russians to come to rescue, but both said no. It's not the case in Iran. Iran, with all domestic troubles and irregularities in management, which all of us know very well, all those who visited Iran. But this is a serious state, serious power with traditions. Also, I think that we should not underestimate the resistance to outside interference there. Yes, of course, the interference is in place, and we know all those rumors, or maybe even not rumors, confirmed facts about infiltration by Mossad in all security systems, but still, it's a very proud nation. And I guess that they might react in this way, in the way of certain consolidation, in case it will be the obvious demonstration of outside support to the radical opposition. But of course, no one knows what will happen. And I don't believe that Russia or China or any of Iran neighbors would try to militarily resist if Americans or Israelis intervene. But at the same time, stakes are very high because if Iran will change the orientation, so to say, it's not just about political or ideological competition. It's about the most important things, about logistics, about transport routes in the region for China, for Russia. That's the most important crossroad. And of course, that will be seen as a very, very important change, negative change. So again, I don't know, but what I can imagine that if this situation will continue for a while, then of course both Russia and China will do everything to try to support the current regime by means they have, by money, by supply of arms, by whatever they might need in this situation. If it will not work, then of course that will be a very dangerous situation, and that will seriously change the whole equation in the region, influencing Southern Caucasus, Central Asia, Middle East for sure. So
what is the worst case scenario for Russia? A regime change, which in the most absurd scenario results in Reza Shah's grandson arriving in Tehran in a pro-American regime. Again, the likelihood of this is very low, but let's pretend. Or a state collapse where Iran fractures and then you end up with chaos.
Objectively, I think that the state collapse would be absolutely disastrous, because state collapse might generate a development which no one can predict. And in case of state collapse, that will be end of any possible projects, a North-South corridor or the Chinese or Indian projects from East Asia and South Asia to Europe and so on. So we saw before what happened when countries in the region collapsed or de facto collapsed, like Iraq, for example. That's nothing positive. The really pro-American regime there, it depends, again, looking at the Venezuelan example, which was very unusual. Okay, is it a pro-American regime now there? Maybe not, but very much constrained by Americans. I guess that to install the really pro-American or American puppets there, this crown prince, I have not enough fantasy to imagine that. Maybe I'm wrong. The pro-American Iran is very difficult to imagine, frankly.
So we are just about a year into Trump's second term, and there have been many apparent twists and turns, but also a fairly consistent, I suppose, new trajectory in some respects. So what do you make of the United States after 1 year of Trump 2?
It's not up to me to judge the United States, and of course I cannot.
And it doesn't have to be your personal opinion exclusively. There's a lot of discussion about Trump in Moscow. So how has that conversation progressed over the year? Have you arrived anywhere, or is it still confusion combined with fascination?
It's less confusion because Trump is actually very consistent. Whatever people in Europe especially say, or Trump's opponents in the United States call him unpredictable, it's not unpredictability, it's something else. It's strategic consistency and tactical creativity. So what we see. But in fact, the conclusion which has been made by all, regardless what people think about Trump, like him or not, is that the liberal world order is over completely. Understandably, the only country which could destroy that world order was the United States, not China, not Russia, not Iran. The country which created this world order decided to get rid of it. That's what happened. I think there is a debate here whether it's sustainable. I mean, when Trump is over, and we can imagine that in the next period will be more troublesome for Trump with the midterm election and many other obstacles, whether it would be possible that the previous approach, rules-based something, might come. I think step by step, majority of commentators and analysts believe that it's irreversible. The tone might change, the format might change, but it's absolutely a new era which started, and it was not because of Trump. Trump was just a symptom, very bold symptom, but still a symptom of those changes which started well before. Then, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a deep reflection and certain degree of confusion what to do with all this, because Russia was very much against the rules-based order. Now we have the order without any rules, or disorder without any rules. And again, the capacity of the United States to do what Americans believe is right and corresponds to their interest is still very, very huge. The positive thing, which many people see as not as a hope, but as a possibility for the future, is the fragmentation of the so-called collective West, the political West. Because, of course, the whole construction of the political West, as we, all of us who are not 85 years old, but younger, all of us grew up and got used to the collective West, the West as an entity. But now it seems to be deconstructed, and we are actually back to the normal, because the political consolidated West was an historically tight phenomenon. The period where this phenomenon was produced is over. And now we see that European attempts to see Trump as an aberration will most likely fail. And then again, what for Russia? Because we see now that this decomposition of the West, Europe and America going astray, means that Americans do whatever they want without taking so much into consideration. I mean, about Russia, about Russian interests. It's rather indifferent. While Europe, without the United States, is actually much more hostile towards Russia than it used to be before. And all the most radical energy and ideas how to conquer, how to deter Russia, how to create a new security system in Europe which would see Russia as an ultimate enemy. And so that comes from Europe. It doesn't come from the United States anymore. And of course,
my sense is that's precisely because they hope that the U.S. has not left. So a Europe that was truly on its own might moderate its hostility to Russia. But because they are concerned about the United States withdrawing, but that outcome has yet to occur, they invoke the Russian threat, which many of them obviously believe in sincerely, as a reason why the United States must stay.
Maybe.
Or do you think in Russia that if the U.S. withdraws from Europe, Europe will remain a collective, unified adversary of Russia?
I think, again, if we try to summarize this, the mood here is rather the latter, that people believe that without the United States, Europe will be maybe not united, because united Europe without this patronage of the United States is pretty difficult to imagine. And we see a lot of domestic splits inside the European Union. But to some extent, Russian issue and Ukrainian issue are the only which can keep European Union today at least, and maybe in the foreseeable future, together. And that's why they are so much unwilling to change position, to adapt their view on the Russia-Ukraine war to the changing situation. Because if we imagine that this issue would be away, I think the conflicts from within will immediately come up. I mean, both domestically in each country, in the big countries, and also in the European Union as such. The general problem, which many analysts here believe is the most acute for Europeans, is that the model of European integration, as it emerged in 20th century and very successfully existed until the beginning of 21st century, that was a great model, I must say. This was one of the most successful political experiments in European history. But it was very much connected to the international environment which has gone. And there is no way to continue with the same model of integration in this new environment, but no one has a slightest idea how to change it, what to change inside the architecture of European integration to respond to those international changes. And that's why what Europeans are trying to do, they're trying to double or triple on efforts to do the same as before, hoping that time will change, Trump will disappear, and so Europe will be great again. I'm afraid it's not the case anymore. Trump might disappear, Trump may even fail, but this situation with the disharmony between the architecture of European Union and international environment will remain. And then it's the desperate situation, and that if so, European politicians are aware of it or feel that, at least, maybe not intellectually, but they feel it, then they have no choice but to try to keep it going as it is. And for Russia-European relations, it's pretty dangerous, actually.
Well, and the one way for the Europeans to keep it going as it is would be to continue to support Ukraine and prevent its defeat, which would perhaps carry existential consequences for the European project, not in the sense of Russian tanks in Berlin or Paris, but because, as you say, this is a political construct that was created in a particular environment. And if Russia demonstrates that the rules have changed, that would seriously impact the very foundations of the European experiment. Given that, what do we do about Ukraine? Is there any possibility for a deal? Because as we've seen, Witkoff visits Moscow, Trump talks to Putin, then the Europeans come in, they change the plan, Putin rejects it, and we have repeated this cycle now many, many times. So if there is this fundamental gulf between Russia and Europe, leaving out, obviously, Ukraine, which is central to this, is there any way to overcome it?
Frankly, I don't know. We will mark a year of very intense diplomatic efforts by the Trump administration pretty soon, I think early February. On the one hand, spirit of anchorage or any other spirit of attempts to come to terms with this conflict is alive. Despite all zigzags, we see certain commitment on both sides. And more than that, during this year, we saw several times that the spiral turned new rounds, I think 4 times. Same trajectory, from hopes to disappointments, back to hopes, back to disappointments. Each time...
Although the good thing about a spiral is that it does eventually come to a point.
It might come to a point because each time, each new turn means a little bit more clarity about how to solve it. But having said that, we see that still now sides are still committed to fighting, I mean militarily. Russia for sure, Ukraine as well. In Moscow, since quite a while, there are people who expect Ukraine to be exhausted and then to give up, but we don't see it yet. It's a very hard advances of the Russian army. Europe, for reasons which we just discussed, is firmly and irreversibly committed to support Ukraine, even by at least promising things which they will never be able to deliver, like, for example, quick membership in the European Union. And Americans, I think, coming back to the beginning of our conversation about capacity of the United States, what the White House diplomacy demonstrated is actually, on the one hand, is the only actor which can do something, which can change situation. At the same time, capacity is limited, is not endless. And the very fact that Trump administration having almost absolute leverage on Ukraine, that's the country which is totally dependent on the West, and they cannot continue without Western support, without American intelligence, without many other things. So this leverage of Americans is huge. Despite that, Trump cannot impose those terms on Zelensky. Zelensky, is Zelensky too sophisticated? Rather, no. But anyway, there are limits of what Americans can do. And that brings me to particular conditions for peace settlement. Unfortunately, we're still basically there where we started. And it sounds extremely nice when Trump or Europeans or Zelensky say that 90% of all those points in the plan already agreed. Yeah, but the rest, the 10% is the territories and the security guarantees. And here we are far, far away. I think that the mood on the Russian side, it didn't change much. So as we see, the conditions put by Putin initially, and at least in this more or less concrete form, at least for 2 years ago, they never change. And in this regard, attempts by Trump, by Europeans, by anybody else to influence Russia in a way that Russia will change approach, will compromise, those attempts don't work.
Could you just, again, for the audience, reformulate Russian objectives? I know Putin has been very consistent in expressing them, but they are also rather general in their formulation and hard to imagine in concrete application.
It's not that general anymore. It was very general at the beginning, that general that not so many people understood what was meant. But in fact, now, almost 4 years after, we understand very well. This is de facto transformation of Ukrainian state to the system which remains independent and sovereign, but has formal limitations to be sure that Ukraine can never be used as a military platform against Russia. Basically, it is what has been called after the Second World War, the Finlandization vis-a-vis another country. And, the stupidity of us, all of us, of the mankind, is that when the whole crisis erupted 2014, wise people like Henry Kissinger and, if I'm not mistaken, even Zbigniew Brzezinski said that Finlandization would be actually the right way to solve it. That would guarantee Ukraine a lot of benefits and satisfy Russia. And I think they were right. But at that time, it was perceived as something absolutely impossible. That's discrimination of sovereignty of Ukraine and so on. Now, it would be great if we could achieve, and many people accept that in the West, even in Europe. But unfortunately, much happens to that. Coming back to conditions, yes, this is the very clearly formulated limitations on Ukrainian military capacity and presence of NATO on the Ukrainian territory. And that was actually, initially, that was it. That was about this, when the whole operation started in 22. And the whole Istanbul process was about that. So at that point, 22, territorial issue was not there, or it was by far not the most important. And I must say that Putin was very consistent when the whole Istanbul process failed in March, April 2022. He said basically, okay, then each next attempt to solve this issue, and the range of issues are on the table, will bring us to the same agenda, but in a worse situation for Ukraine. And that consistently happens. Of course, now, since Russia took a significant part of Ukrainian territory since that, so now you cannot ignore this. So now the territorial issue came to the forefront. For some people, that's maybe the most important thing. I still don't believe that Putin considers territory as the key element, but unlike 2022, we cannot compromise on the territorial configuration that easily that it could be done at that time. And
unfortunately, Russian control of the entirety of Donetsk non-negotiable, or at least Ukrainian withdrawal from it? Because I understand that territory might not be the prime concern, but that particular issue keeps resurfacing as a key Russian demand.
It looks like now it's non-negotiable. Whether it was negotiable before, I don't know. But Now it is, because after all those statements, all statements made from the Ukrainian side, all responses from Russian side, now this is one of the key elements. And of course, what happened in September 22 with the change of Russian constitution, that made the whole situation pretty irreversible in terms of this Donbas territory. I'm afraid that at this point, it's not the most important thing either, because beyond the Donbas, Russia has made significant advances in other regions of Ukraine as well. And the more advances, the less probability that those territories will be given back and so on. So that's unfortunately like a vicious circle. The longer you reject negotiations, as Putin said many times, the worse conditions you get.
Well, one could argue that Russia also suffers the longer this goes on and bears costs in the immediate term and in the long term to future Russia strength. So perhaps both sides have, inarguably both sides have suffered since Istanbul.
No doubt about that. Just one thing, yes, of course. And I think the understanding of long-term costs of this prolonged conflict is there in Russia. But in this situation, that's a matter of principle anymore. And on the Russian side, there is a deep conviction, at least for now, that Russia has a bigger capacity and bigger resource to continue. And it will continue as long as these resources are in place.
How seriously should we take the political demands tied to Russian language rights, status of the Orthodox Church, denazification, so-called? Is that as important as the objectives you've already listed, or is that clearly a second-order interest?
No, I don't think it's a second order, because this is exactly about the nature of Ukrainian statehood. Because in the current form, especially during the war, Ukraine transformed into a radically anti-Russian entity, radically. It's not just a country with some conflicting interest. It's the statehood based on anti-Russian foundation. I think that, unfortunately, this is not of secondary importance. That's really one of the core demands.
But Russia still believes that if Ukraine make certain commitments on paper regarding Russian language, Orthodox Church, etc., that even after this brutal war, Ukraine might change its attitude towards Russia. Because you say since 2014, the state is radically anti-Russian, but also after the war, presumably the population will be largely unsympathetic to Russia, to put it mildly. Or is there a sense that over time, if Russian language is permitted, things will gradually change?
That's the question. I don't know how, historically, we can remember different situation in this area. So after what happened during the civil war 100 years ago, exactly on the Ukrainian territory, it was very difficult to imagine that people living there would at any point in the future be able to coexist. But it happened even before, in 17th century, in 18th century, we had examples. I don't mean that we should or can expect the repetition of what was centuries ago, but history teaches us that changes might be pretty significant, especially given the fact that what we discussed at the beginning of our podcast, that everything is changing completely around us. And of course, I said it many times, maybe even we discussed it last time when I was guest of your program. The whole battle in Ukraine is actually not about the future. It's about the past. That's problems never seriously discussed, considered, and settled after the Cold War. Consequences of collapse, the way how the Soviet Union collapsed and how the whole European arrangement was made after 1991. And this is the last battle of the Cold War, actually. It's not the battle for the future of Ukraine, of Russia, of Europe. In a way, it is now, because it's a very big conflict. But initially, those so-called deep, how Putin says, the deep roots of the conflict, they go back to that period. What I mentioned before, that Russia is trying with very big troubles, mental troubles, to leave the period when we considered the whole area through the lenses of the former Soviet Union. It does not mean that the future relationship between Russians and Ukrainians, Russia and Ukraine, will be profoundly different. But to say that now we are bound to be enemies forever, like India and Pakistan, probably it's too much.
What kind of regime does Russia envision in Ukraine? Can Zelensky remain the leader? Is a Venezuela scenario acceptable where Zelensky somehow leaves, but somebody from this regime takes over, whether it's Zaluzhny or Budanov or somebody else? Or is Russia seeking a real reboot of the entire regime?
Certainly not Zelensky. Zelensky is a symbol of something which Russia certainly will not tolerate anymore. Another regime may be. Of course, the ideal picture is that the completely new group of people will come, but Russia has no constituency in Ukraine. Russia has no political environment which could be suitable and pro-Russian or loyal to Russia. I don't believe that kind of political forces do exist in Ukraine now. But probably the more pragmatic people who would understand that Ukraine will be probably totally destroyed if the military conflict will continue, I can imagine that under certain circumstances, Russia would accept it. But of course, the conditions are quite multiple. Now, again, back to the previous issue, combination of the geopolitical constellation plus territories and the European factor. So because we speak about Ukraine, but Ukraine is a function, as we said, a function of the European situation. And of course, for Europeans, if they at some point finally arrive to the understanding that they need to discuss with Russia. Now, some politicians there, like Meloni, they start saying that. I don't think it's serious, but still.
Or even Macron wants
Macron,
to sit at the end of the long table across from Putin once more.
Okay, Macron. So, but anyway, as it looks now, it's the totally unbearable task to formulate something which would more or less suit all at this point. We don't know what will happen in case Russia will finally, through big losses, through big efforts, but finally demonstrate that Ukrainian statehood is endangered by the continuation of this war. Maybe it might be changed. But again, coming back to the beginning of this Ukrainian part of conversation, I hope that 2026 will be the last year of this military confrontation, but I'm not sure.
Well, so from what you say, it's clear that Russia believes that time is on its side and is willing to continue to press its advantage until that advantage becomes clear to all, assuming that that is possible. Is there any concern that the U.S. deal might expire, that Trump's offer of normalization, of business ties, of total diplomatic reset, that offer will be taken off the table for domestic political reasons in the coming 6 months?
Yeah, Trump has his own agenda, and we understand that he will be consumed by the internal struggle pretty soon, midterm election and so on. Some people here think that we have 2 or 3 months more of Trump's attention to this matter. Will it be a blow to Russian expectations? Maybe not. Putin is clearly interested to keep Trump on board. Clearly. Whatever happens, he's trying to be extremely polite and constructive vis-a-vis Trump. But you can find views here that if Trump will walk away, as he promised a couple of times, and not increase support of Ukraine. Maybe not cut what it is in place, but not increase it. Then maybe it's okay with Russia, that Russia still has resource and potential to continue with its agenda in case United States will be occupied by their own issues.
But so a hypothetical victory in Ukraine that is not accompanied by a real improvement in U.S.-Russia relations is preferable to a compromise in Ukraine and a real normalization of U.S.-Russia relations that may also have the effect of definitively splitting the collective West that you mentioned before, because it's hard to imagine that maintaining any coherence if the U.S. and Russia start building positive relations over the heads of the Europeans.
First of all, I think everybody understands here, and I think it's true, that any other projects or areas of cooperation between Russia and the United States might be discussed and explored only after the Ukrainian issue will be settled. So those ideas, initial ideas, which we heard in February, March 25, let us start with easier issues like to reinstate diplomatic services, which is really easy, and then we can step-by-step approach to the most complicated ones. It does work. For me, it was always from the beginning. First Ukraine, then everything else.
Well, so the question is whether you want a lot in Ukraine and a little bit of everything else, or a little bit in Ukraine and a lot of everything else. And the Americans believe that they, or the administration, are offering a lot after Ukraine is settled, and that the Russians are being very obstinate, trying to settle some small problem when they could do great things with the U.S. after that is solved. In Russia, it seems like the attitude is the reverse.
Well, Russia has a pretty bad experience with the different American and European administrations after the Cold War, when very bright futures were described and nothing happened when Russia did what Western counterparts wanted Russian government to do. So that's why I'm afraid it's a bit personal, and Putin put too many hopes on his relationships with previous leaders, be it George W. Bush or Chirac or Schroeder and anybody else. It's a bit problematic in this regard. The problem is that Ukraine is seen here as something that important for everything, for Russian existential future, for the future of Russian civilization, that this issue cannot be put in the framework of relative advantages. So let's compromise here, but get something else there. I'm afraid it's not possible. It's not possible both politically and even, which is worse, more complicated, psychologically. So rightly or wrongly, we can discuss it, but it's fact of life. And another issue, which unfortunately has some explanations in history, the whole history of Russian diplomacy after wars, except world wars like Napoleonic Wars or Second World War, shows that the moment Russia stops military operations, since that moment, at any diplomatic negotiations, Russia can only give something, never gain, only give some of what military previously got. And this is, unfortunately, this is how it worked always in Russian history. And that's why the idea initially supported by Trump, first ceasefire, then negotiation, that was dead from on arrival. So it was absolutely impossible. So to make a long story short, the importance of Ukrainian issue, again, you might agree or disagree. You might say that this is some kind of an obsession. We can discuss it. But the importance of Ukrainian issue for perception of a Russia role in the world and Russian future, existential future, is that big that it is hardly measurable in the context of deals, what Trump likes.
Well, to finish, let's try to imagine a world after some deal is done. So in 10 years, the Ukraine war has ended one way or another. The liberal order is dead and buried. what sort of world would Russia like to exist within, ideally and realistically?
That's a rare moment in history when no one has a clear picture of the world, not only here. I think if we ask Chinese, of course they have, and they will very eloquently describe it. But it will have nothing to do with the real chances. I think a Russian trajectory after collapse of the Soviet Union until now, and most likely it will continue in the future, is the self-determination as a big Eurasian power with clear understanding of its limitations of its capacities. Those capacities are very huge, but they are limited. And Russia will not be back to the highest level of international system as a superpower. No potential, no resources, and no need, actually, no wish. If we talk about an ideal picture, actually Russia, given its size, its potential, its geographic location, Russia is the country which would mostly benefit of a very strong and stable peace in the world. Because if there is a peace and everybody thinks about cooperation, about benefits, and so on, you cannot bypass Russia. Russia is an indispensable power, to use the term of Madeleine Albright about the United States. Indispensable because whatever you do, you have to cooperate with Russia, and Russia has to cooperate with the rest of the world. But this is an ideal picture of a world where people are purely rational. It's not the case. And that's why I don't believe that we can expect that anytime soon. But there is something which we should aspire. Realistically, I think that Russia, again, after the end of this war, however it ends, Russia will obtain a big experience, both in military terms, but also in understanding how to avoid necessity to using military force. Because, again, maybe I'm too naive, but I think that despite all rhetorics we hear on Russian television, for example, but there is a growing understanding also among the ruling group that this is not the way how we have to address the challenges Russia will face. Let's assume that that was inevitable, that was a product of the previous development, and as Putin said in February 22, we had no choice but to start. Okay, but it is not, it should be an exception. And there are, in the contemporary world, there are a lot of other means how to address vital interests. And by the way, President Trump demonstrates some of those means. Of course, no one can replicate the United States, but the very approach that to avoid direct collisions, but by some interesting, creative ways to achieve things, combining PR, rhetoric, deals, hidden diplomacy, open diplomacy, and a demonstration of force, that's something which I hope Russia will also learn a little bit from the United States.
Making military operations special again.
Exactly.
Okay, well, so the U.S. is the indispensable power, and Russia is literally the unavoidable power geographically. So let's end on that. Thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.